The morning had started like any other in our quiet suburban neighborhood, the sun casting long golden rays over perfectly trimmed lawns and identical townhouses that seemed to stretch endlessly down the streets, each one a reflection of the next, a meticulously crafted display of conformity, overseen by the almighty HOA, whose grip on this little paradise had long been the subject of whispered complaints and covert eye-rolls among the residents. I had parked my car in my own driveway, a modest but carefully maintained vehicle that had been a part of my life for years, and had gone about my usual routine of checking emails and sipping coffee when I received the dreaded call. Karen, the infamous HOA president known for her obsession with rules and her personal vendetta against anything that didn't fit her vision of perfection, had decided my car violated some obscure regulation I had never even known existed. The words she had used when leaving the message, clipped in self-righteous, made it clear she had taken personal satisfaction in the act. My car would be towed if not moved immediately. My heart sank, but it also ignited a spark of irritation that had been simmering under the surface for months. This was not the first time Karen had flexed her authority in absurd ways, and I had witnessed neighbors groaning under her relentless enforcement of trivial rules, from the precise angle at which trash bins could be placed to the specific color of flowers permitted in front yards. Yet somehow, this towing incident felt different. It felt personal, like the culmination of years of minor humiliations designed to assert dominance over a neighborhood she considered her kingdom. I quickly realized that while she may have had a roster of regulations at her disposal, she had no idea who she was truly dealing with. I began plotting not out of malice, but out of sheer disbelief that one person could wield so much power with so little accountability. I thought about the countless hours I had spent dreaming of subtle, ironic justice, of ways to show her and the rest of the HOA that their authority had limits, that rules without perspective and empathy were meaningless. My mind raced through scenarios, some borderline fantastical, others grounded in cold, calculated reality. I had to respond in a way that was unequivocal, unforgettable, and, above all, within my rights. As I considered my options, the idea began to crystallize. If Karen wanted to escalate this to the absurd, then absurdity was what she would get in return. And as my thoughts solidified, a plan emerged, one that would involve precise timing, careful coordination, and a very large piece of machinery, the likes of which no one in this neighborhood had ever imagined seeing in front of a row of immaculate homes. The logistics were daunting, but the principle was simple. If she thought she could unilaterally disrupt my life, I would respond in a way so monumental, so outrageous, that it would permanently recalibrate the balance of power. As I made preliminary calls, checked schedules, and ensured legal coverage, I felt a strange mix of exhilaration and disbelief. This wasn't just about a car being towed. It was about reclaiming dignity in a place where petty power had long reigned supreme, about sending a message that the rules did not exist in isolation from common sense. And so, with the sun climbing higher, the plan began to take shape. A shadowy silhouette against the backdrop of manicured lawns, promising a day that Karen would never forget. By the time I stepped outside, the tow truck had already come and gone, leaving behind nothing but 2 faint tire marks on the asphalt and a hollow space in my driveway that felt far louder than the noise of the engine that had hauled my car away. And as I stood there staring at the emptiness, I realized Karen hadn't just enforced a rule, she had made a statement, one that said she could reach into my life whenever she pleased and rearrange it according to her personal sense of order. I called the towing company and was met with a bored voice that recited fees and policies like a memorized chant, confirming that the tow had been authorized by the HOA and that retrieving my car would cost me more than the infraction itself was worth, and it was. In that moment that my irritation hardened into resolve. I walked the neighborhood afterward, partly to clear my head and partly to observe. And everywhere I went, I saw the same thing. People keeping their heads down, lawns trimmed to regulation height, curtains drawn just enough to watch without being seen. The quiet compliance of residents who had learned that resistance only brought more scrutiny. Karen's influence was unmistakable. Her house sat at the corner like a command post, flags perfectly aligned, decorative stones arranged with military precision, and her security camera angled just enough to capture the entire street. And I knew she was watching me as I passed, waiting for a reaction. I gave her none. Instead, I went home and opened my laptop, pulling up old contacts, people from my previous life that I hadn't needed to call in years. And with each conversation the plan grew more tangible. I wasn't looking for revenge in the traditional sense. I wanted clarity, a demonstration so undeniable that even Karen's rulebook wouldn't be able to explain it away. I spent the afternoon reviewing bylaws and zoning permissions, discovering that while the HOA had authority over parking aesthetics and vehicle storage, they had absolutely no jurisdiction over temporary commercial equipment on private property provided the proper permits were filed. That loophole was the crack in the wall I needed. As evening fell, I drove a rental car back into the neighborhood, noticing how a few residents paused mid-walk, curiosity flickering in their eyes, sensing that something was off. Word traveled fast here, and by nightfall, people already knew my car had been towed. Sympathy was silent but present, conveyed through nods and tight smiles, and it only strengthened my conviction. I submitted the necessary paperwork that night, triple-checking every clause. Every date? every signature, ensuring that what I was about to do would be flawless from a legal standpoint. The equipment I had in mind wasn't subtle, and that was precisely the point. It would be impossible to ignore, impossible to spin, and impossible to intimidate. As I finalized arrangements, I imagined Karen's reaction, the way her carefully composed authority would fracture when confronted with something far outside her realm of control, and the thought brought a rare, calm satisfaction. This wasn't about humiliating her in front of the neighborhood. It was about exposing the imbalance she had cultivated and forcing a reckoning she could not avoid. By the time I shut down my computer and prepared for bed, the gears were already in motion, contracts signed, transport scheduled, and notifications sent to the appropriate offices, and I fell asleep not with anger, but with anticipation, knowing that the following day would introduce an object so massive, so utterly incompatible with the sterile order of the HOA, that it would shake the very foundation of Karen's authority. The next morning arrived with a crispness in the air that felt almost conspiratorial, as if the universe itself were conspiring with me. And by the time the massive transport truck rumbled down the street, the quiet suburban calm had already begun to tremble in anticipation, though the residents had no idea why. Only I knew what was coming, and as the truck turned the corner, its engine growling like a beast waking from a long slumber, heads began to pop out of windows, neighbors craning their necks in disbelief at the sight of a 25-ton military tank being maneuvered onto the narrow street, the sun reflecting off its steel surface, glinting with a sheen that made it look simultaneously terrifying and magnificent. Karen, of course, was the first to react. Her office window overlooking the neighborhood capturing the moment her jaw dropped, her fingers frozen in midair as she held the phone she had presumably intended to call the HOA board, her carefully manicured nails momentarily useless in the face of such unprecedented chaos. And I could almost see her internal monologue racing, the decades of rule enforcement and petty tyranny colliding with a reality she could not anticipate. No bylaws, no regulations, no HOA authority could explain or prevent the sheer absurdity of a tank in front of her pristine home. The driver, a professional I had hired specifically for his experience with heavy military vehicles, guided the tank down the street with slow, deliberate precision, the weight of the machine pressing the asphalt into subtle waves, the vibration carrying into homes and rattling picture frames. A physical reminder that authority could be challenged in ways far beyond the petty letter of HOA regulations. As the tank came to a halt in the middle of the road, directly across from my driveway, I stepped out of my own vehicle and waved casually to the onlookers, my expression calm, almost indifferent, as if this were an everyday occurrence. Murmurs erupted in the street, neighbors whispering to one another, cameras and phones, emerging like flowers after a storm, all capturing the spectacle. The most surreal community event anyone had ever witnessed, and the contrast between Karen's rigidity and the sheer audacity of the situation could not have been more stark. I had positioned the tank not to damage property, not to harm anyone, but to make a statement. The power she wielded was conditional, fragile, and susceptible to disruption when confronted with something entirely outside her conceptual box of control. Karen emerged from her house, still in a robe, her face a mixture of horror, outrage, and disbelief, and she began shouting orders to imaginary subordinates, perhaps hoping one of the other board members would appear to assert some form of authority. But no one came. The streets were hers and mine, a battlefield of optics, and she realized, slowly, that she could not command the situation, could not tow the tank, could not enforce a single rule against the laws of physics or common sense. I watched as she stormed toward her front yard, pointing and gesticulating wildly, her voice carrying down the street as neighbors peeked over fences, captivated by the absurd theater unfolding before them. Some nodded in silent approval. Others covered their mouths to hide laughter, and a few younger residents openly cheered, recognizing that the spectacle was a long overdue correction in the social balance of the neighborhood. I moved closer to the tank, inspecting it with an air of casual authority, pretending to calibrate imaginary controls, adjusting levers that did nothing, allowing the tension to build every second, a test of Karen's composure and her inability to regain dominance. The mere presence of the tank shifted the neighborhood's energy. Residents who had been cowed by her rules now smiled, exchanged glances, and whispered about how thrilling it was to see someone finally stand up to her, a collective unspoken acknowledgement that the social order had been, even if temporarily, overturned. Karen, red-faced and shaking, realized that confrontation alone would not resolve the situation. She tried to negotiate, to reason, to assert authority in ways she had perfected over the years, but I refused to engage directly, maintaining a calm, deliberate pace, allowing the visual spectacle to communicate the message far more effectively than words ever could. Petty power has limits, and when pushed beyond reason, it becomes laughable. The tank remained stationary, dominating the street, a symbol of absurdity and yet undeniable power, until I finally stepped back and waved again at the growing crowd, a silent signal that the matter was under control, yet still outside the realm of Karen's authority. And as she retreated back into her house, shoulders slumped and confidence shattered, I could see that this single, deliberate act, grounded in legality, audacity, and impeccable timing, had already achieved what months of complaints, petitions, and polite resistance had failed to accomplish. It had rewritten the rules of engagement, if only for a moment, in a neighborhood that had long been suffocated by minutiae and fear of authority. The aftermath of the tank's arrival was immediate. An electric ripple of astonishment and whispered excitement spreading through the neighborhood. Like wildfire as residents emerged from their homes, some cautiously, some with glee, gathering along sidewalks, peeking from behind fences, and craning necks over hedges to witness what had to be one of the most surreal displays of defiance they had ever seen. While Karen, the embodiment of suburban authority, retreated to her house like a general faced with an opponent she could not comprehend, her hands shaking as she dialed the HOA office, only to be met with blank stares and confusion on the other end. Realizing that this escalation had utterly bypassed the chain of command she had so meticulously constructed over years, and that no bylaw, no regulation, and no petty fine could counteract the reality of a 25-ton steel vehicle occupying her carefully ordered streets, I wandered the neighborhood casually greeting neighbors as though nothing unusual were happening, enjoying the subtle shifts in posture, the glances of approval, and the faint relieved smiles that betrayed the quiet exasperation they had all felt under Karen's relentless scrutiny. Whispers of disbelief ran through the crowd as people compared their memories of petty fines, unsolicited warnings, and tedious HOA notices to the absurdity of what they were now witnessing, realizing that someone had finally turned the tables in a way that was simultaneously legal, spectacular, and utterly impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Karen attempted to rally support, shouting orders from her porch, demanding explanations from board members, and even trying to summon law enforcement with a mixture of indignation and desperation, but each effort was met with logistical delays, bureaucratic protocol, and, increasingly, the realization that the tank's presence had been fully sanctioned under local zoning permits I had carefully obtained, leaving her arguments impotent and hollow, her authority evaporating in real time as neighbors observed the spectacle unfold. Children, emboldened by the rare chaos in their meticulously maintained environment, darted along the sidewalks, pointing and laughing, while a few bold teenagers climbed onto low walls to snap photos. The images already circulating on neighborhood social media pages and group chats. Each post a mix of awe, humor, and thinly veiled admiration for the audacity of the act, and for the first time in memory, the community's attention shifted from compliance to curiosity, from fear to fascination, from submission to subtle celebration. I made my way closer to the tank, inspecting the machinery with casual interest, explaining to intrigued neighbors how the hydraulics and tracks functioned in simple terms, though of course this was performative part of the show, letting the audience savor the magnitude of the moment, without ever revealing the full extent of my planning. By the time Karen had regrouped enough to attempt a coordinated verbal assault, she found the neighborhood's eyes no longer fixed solely on her but on the absurdity of her own impotence, on the steel behemoth that symbolized resistance to arbitrary authority, and on the collective realization that the system she had enforced so rigidly was not infallible. Legal observers, some called by curious neighbors, others arriving independently after noticing the unusual vehicle in a residential area, arrived to confirm that my actions were entirely within the bounds of local law permits, verified insurance checked, and no regulations violated. Each validation was a hammer to Karen's confidence. Each nod and signature a silent but definitive statement that her attempt to assert control over my personal property had been nullified by foresight, preparation, and a willingness to act when rules and power structures collided with common sense. As the sun climbed higher, shadows stretching across the asphalt beneath the tank's massive tracks, Karen finally emerged again, red-faced, her carefully curated composure shattered, trying one last time to lecture, argue, and intimidate, but the words fell flat. Carried away by murmurs of the crowd, the subtle smiles of neighbors who had long grown weary of her iron grip, and the undeniable presence of a machine that dwarfed everything else in its path, making her authority look small, fragile, and laughably inconsequential. I stood beside the tank, arms crossed, radiating calm confidence, letting the spectacle speak for itself, while whispers grew into conversations into laughter, and laughter into the kind of communal relief that only comes when a long-standing imbalance is suddenly corrected in an extraordinary, unforgettable way. By the time Karen stormed back inside, slamming doors with a fury that only served to entertain the neighborhood, it was clear that her reign of arbitrary power had been interrupted, if not entirely ended, and that the collective imagination of the residents had been awakened, proving that audacity, legality, and strategic planning could dismantle even the most entrenched systems of control in ways that were both spectacular and irreversible, at least in memory and in the eyes of a community that had been silently yearning for a moment exactly like this. By mid-afternoon, the situation had evolved into something almost theatrical, a performance that blurred the lines between reality and spectacle, with neighbors lingering on their porches, cameras in hand, and smartphones raised like banners of rebellion, while Karen, seething inside her house, fumed at the unfolding scene that she could neither control nor comprehend, pacing her living room as if sheer frustration might magically restore her authority, calling the HOA office repeatedly and leaving increasingly frantic messages that grew harsher with every attempt. all the while imagining the humiliation that the neighborhood must be feeling. And yet, unbeknownst to her, her panic had only amplified the impact of the tank's presence, transforming a calculated act of legal defiance into a psychological spectacle, demonstrating that preparation, audacity, and timing could utterly disarm even the most meticulously self-assured ruler. I continued to engage with curious onlookers, answering questions, explaining that the tank was fully permitted, and subtly allowing them to appreciate not just its physical size, but the symbolic weight it carried against oppressive authority, knowing that each nod of understanding, each chuckle of disbelief, each whispered "finally someone did," it would chip away at Karen as perceived power while bolstering the community's morale and confidence in the absurdity of her strictures. Karen, realizing that direct confrontation would not yield results, began plotting alternatives, considering calls to City Hall, emergency services, and even local news stations, hoping that outside intervention might force me to remove the tank. Yet each option was fraught with delay, paperwork, and legal constraints she had underestimated, leaving her powerless in the face of a reality that she had no control over. And as she scrambled to regain composure, I could sense the shift in her demeanor from confident dominator to frustrated spectator, a transformation that was both satisfying and instructive, demonstrating the fragility of perceived power when faced with carefully executed strategy and unorthodox thinking. Throughout the afternoon, conversations in the neighborhood shifted from cautious observation to open commentary, neighbors speculating on how I had acquired such a vehicle, how it could legally occupy the street, and what message it sent about resistance to arbitrary authority. And while the tank itself remained stationary, its presence ignited waves of reflection among residents, sparking discussions about fairness, compliance, and the limits of HOA power, as well as a cautious hope that the absurdity of this confrontation might embolden them to question or resist minor tyrannies that had long gone unchallenged. Meanwhile, Karen attempted a series of increasingly desperate measures, from shouting through windows to waving phones at passing neighbors, hoping to elicit support or to shame me into removal, but each action only seemed to confirm to onlookers her inability to control events. And her escalating panic, contrasted against my calm composure, served to further highlight the imbalance of power she had previously wielded without opposition, exposing her authority as performative, contingent, and ultimately powerless when confronted with ingenuity backed by legality. As the sun dipped lower, shadows lengthening across the street, I coordinated with the tank operator to conduct a slow demonstration, moving it just slightly back and forth, enough to produce minor vibrations, a subtle reminder that its presence was not just symbolic but physically tangible, and that any attempt to ignore or dismiss it would be futile. Neighbors laughed, pointed, and whispered to each other while Karen, pacing her porch with arms crossed and face red with fury, realized that the spectacle had transcended her personal vendetta, becoming a communal event that none could control or erase. Eventually, the situation drew attention from local authorities, curious city inspectors and traffic officers arriving to verify permits, safety measures, and legality. And each confirmation that everything was in order was like a strike against Karen's authority, eroding her credibility and demonstrating that her obsession with enforcement had no grounding when juxtaposed with careful planning and lawful action. And as they left with nods and formalities, the tank remained a silent, gleaming testament to audacity, preparation, and the recalibration of power dynamics within a community that had long been stifled under petty tyranny. By evening, as residents lingered in driveways and along sidewalks, sharing photos and retelling the events of the day in hushed tones and amused laughter, Karen retreated entirely from public view, locking doors, closing blinds, and muttering to herself in frustration, while the neighborhood collectively processed what had happened, a clear, undeniable statement that authority has limits, that rules without perspective can be challenged, and that audacity combined with preparation could produce a spectacle so extraordinary that it would leave an entire community rethinking long-held assumptions about power, obedience, and justice. And as I finally surveyed the scene from my own driveway, standing beside the massive tank with a sense of calm triumph, I knew that today would be remembered not just as the day my car was towed, but as the day a single, carefully calculated act of defiance reshaped the social fabric of a neighborhood and reminded everyone, including Karen, that control is never absolute and that sometimes the most effective response to petty tyranny is a combination of legality, audacity, and sheer undeniable spectacle. As twilight settled over the neighborhood, the tank's massive silhouette cast long, dramatic shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns, creating a surreal tableau that seemed more like a staged cinematic set than a quiet suburban street. And the neighborhood buzzed with energy unlike anything seen before. Residents lingered outside, leaning on fences, stepping into driveways, and speaking in low, excited tones as cameras clicked and videos streamed live to social media, each clip capturing the absurdity and audacity of the moment. While Karen, trapped inside her home, frantically attempted to regain control, her shouts muffled behind closed windows, her body pacing in small, anxious circles, as if sheer movement could somehow reassert the authority she had so carefully constructed over the years. I walked along the street slowly, greeting curious neighbors, explaining technical details of the tank in a casual tone, and letting the spectacle itself communicate my message. A clear demonstration that rules, no matter how rigidly enforced by someone like Karen, had boundaries when faced with preparation, audacity, and legality. And that compliance born of fear was always conditional, always fragile, and often amusingly reversible. Whispers and laughter spread quickly, and even the most timid residents dared to emerge from behind their doors, some clapping quietly, some shaking their heads in disbelief, all sensing that a pivotal moment in the neighborhood's social history was unfolding before their eyes. Children, emboldened by the absurdity, darted between parked cars, pointing excitedly at the tracks and massive turret, while teenagers recorded every detail, narrating it to friends in awe and exaggeration, already knowing this story would circulate widely for years. Karen's attempts to assert control became more erratic, ranging from desperate phone calls to the HOA to frantic messages to neighbors she assumed would side with her. But each attempt was met with indifference or amusement, her credibility eroding with every failed tactic. And the collective consciousness of the neighborhood shifted subtly but irrevocably from obedience to observation, from submission to curiosity, from fear to an energized recognition that even the most rigid authority could be challenged and, when done thoughtfully, publicly, and legally, rendered powerless. As night fell, the lights from homes reflected off the tank's steel surface, giving it an almost ethereal glow, and I took a moment to appreciate the surreal nature of the situation. A quiet street, once dominated by petty rules and meticulous oversight, now transformed into a stage for audacious resistance, a place where humor, legality, and spectacle converged to rewrite the rules of social engagement, at least temporarily. Local authorities, having completed their inspections, confirmed that all permits, safety measures, and zoning requirements had been properly addressed, their formal nods and recorded statements serving as the ultimate validation, further undermining Karen's position, as she could no longer claim that the situation was illegal or inappropriate, leaving her with nothing but her growing frustration and the impotent fury of someone who had realized too late that control is conditional, and respect must be earned, not demanded. Residents began sharing stories and speculations about the event, debating whether it was premeditated or spontaneous, each account adding layers of myth and legend to the day's events. While Karen remained isolated in her home, slamming doors, muttering angrily, and pacing in frustration, fully aware that she had been outmaneuvered in a manner that was both public and undeniable, and the visual impact of the tank, the audacity of the act, and the calm control I maintained all combined to create an image that would linger in the collective memory of the neighborhood for years. A powerful reminder of what happens when preparation meets creativity and legality. By the end of the night, the street had transformed into a place of quiet celebration. Neighbors gathered in small clusters exchanging laughs, selfies, and comments about how someone had finally stood up to Karen's tyranny in a way that was both spectacular and unassailable, and even those who had previously been timid or fearful felt a subtle empowerment, the knowledge that authority is strongest only when unquestioned, and that bold legal actions can challenge even the most entrenched systems. I stood beside the tank one last time before nightfall, surveying the street with satisfaction, observing the subtle shift in energy, the glances of approval, the laughter, and the quiet nods of respect from neighbors who now understood the full impact of the day's events. While Karen, confined to her home, could only observe the transformation from the other side of closed blinds, a mixture of anger, disbelief, and reluctant acknowledgement registering in her expression, realizing that this single act, a combination of audacity, legality, and sheer spectacle, had permanently altered the balance of power in the neighborhood, leaving a legacy of both hilarity and respect that would be discussed for years to come. And as I finally stepped away, the night air cool and still, I knew that the message was clear. Rules have limits, authority is conditional, and audacity, when executed with preparation and precision, can change the course of even the most rigidly controlled community. The following morning, the neighborhood woke to a strange calm, almost as if the previous day's chaos had reset the usual rhythm of suburban life, yet the air was thick with anticipation, whispers circulating quickly about the spectacle of the 25-ton tank still stationed firmly in the middle of the street, and Karen, now fully aware that she had lost control in a way that was both public and humiliating, attempted one last series of desperate maneuvers, pacing her living room in a flurry of anger and disbelief, calling HOA board members, local officials, and even a few sympathetic neighbors she thought might side with her. But each call ended in silence, confusion, or outright refusal to intervene, and with every unanswered demand, her frustration mounted, transforming her once imposing presence into something almost pitiable, a ruler confronted with the impossibility of enforcing authority when faced with bold, prepared, and lawful defiance. I spent the morning observing from my driveway, noting the subtle changes in neighborhood behavior as residents, emboldened by the previous day's events, stepped into the street with cautious excitement, exchanging stories, snapping photos, and speculating about the planning, timing, and audacity required to orchestrate such a public display, all the while keeping a calm and composed demeanor that contrasted sharply with Karen's frantic energy. reinforcing the impression that I was not just in control of the situation, but fully aware of the psychological impact it was having on her and the community at large. Attempts by Karen to mobilize authority became increasingly absurd. She waved phones frantically from her porch, shouted at passersby, and even attempted to petition local law enforcement to remove the tank. But her complaints were met with patient explanations of permits, legal obligations, and jurisdictional boundaries, leaving her impotent and increasingly red-faced. Her carefully constructed empire of control reduced to verbal gestures that held no real power, and I could see the dawning realization in her expression that her authority, once absolute in her mind, had been spectacularly undermined by preparation, audacity, and the simple fact that the tank was entirely legal and entirely immovable. Neighbors began to openly discuss the audacity of the act, whispering and laughing in small groups, comparing notes about how they had silently endured Karen's petty rules for years, and marveling at the way one calculated display had rewritten the neighborhood's social hierarchy, transforming fear and compliance into admiration, amusement, and a newfound sense of empowerment. Children, emboldened by the absurdity, played near the tank's edges under cautious supervision, while teenagers streamed the event online, ensuring that the story would circulate beyond the neighborhood, further cementing the act's legendary status and guaranteeing that Karen's humiliation would be remembered widely. Karen, realizing that conventional tactics would not suffice, attempted a series of dramatic gestures, shouting, waving, and even threatening legal action, but these were rendered meaningless by the obvious legality of the situation, the tank itself serving as a tangible, immovable reminder that preparation and creativity could overpower even the most rigidly enforced rules. And as the morning stretched into afternoon, her energy shifted from anger to desperation, then to disbelief, a progression mirrored by the growing confidence and amusement of the neighbors who finally understood that the rules Karen had imposed were conditional, and that real power was never absolute. I walked deliberately along the street, greeting neighbors, answering technical questions about the tank, and subtly reinforcing the spectacle, ensuring that each observer appreciated not just the absurdity, but the deliberate planning and legal forethought that had allowed this event to unfold without a single misstep. And with each nod, whisper, and laugh, Karen's authority eroded further, her once dominant presence replaced by incredulity and helplessness. The psychological impact of her loss magnified by the attention and admiration of those who had long felt stifled by her rule. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the asphalt, Karen finally appeared at her window once more, her expression a mix of fury, humiliation, and reluctant acknowledgement, signaling that she had understood the magnitude of her defeat, while I, standing beside the tank with calm authority, surveyed the transformed neighborhood, aware that the events of the past 2 days had done more than reclaim a car or assert personal rights. They had shifted the balance of social power, exposed the fragility of petty authority, and reminded everyone watching that audacity, preparation, and legality can combine to create a spectacle so overwhelming that even the most rigid rules and the most determined enforcer are rendered powerless, leaving an indelible mark on both the participants and the observers, a story that would be recounted, retold, and remembered as the day when a tank not only reclaimed a driveway but also redefined what it meant to stand up to authority. By the end of the day, the neighborhood had settled into a strange combination of normalcy and residual exhilaration, the streets still dominated by the imposing silhouette of the tank, which now seemed less like a machine and more like a monument to audacity, careful planning, and the limits of authority, while Karen, fully aware that her attempts to assert control had failed spectacularly, remained trapped in her house, pacing back and forth, muttering to herself, and occasionally peeking through blinds only to witness the ongoing, unbothered activity outside, realizing that she had been outmaneuvered not through chaos or confrontation, but through precise, legal, and imaginative action that left her powerless and humiliated in front of the entire neighborhood. Residents moved more freely than they had in years, greeting each other with subtle nods, sharing stories, laughing quietly, and remarking on the absurdity of the day. The presence of the tank serving as both entertainment and a symbol of empowerment, a reminder that someone could challenge oppressive control while remaining within the bounds of law and that petty rules, however rigidly enforced, could be disrupted when confronted with audacity and careful planning. Karen, still seething inside, attempted one last round of communication with the HOA, drafting long, frantic emails filled with accusations, demands, and threats, only to be met with polite but firm refusals, bureaucratic procedures, and reminders that the vehicle's presence was entirely lawful and permitted, leaving her with no avenue to regain dominance, no power left to wield against me, and no explanation that could restore her previously unchallenged authority in the eyes of the neighborhood. Her frustration, once potent and commanding, had now become a private spectacle of failure, a quiet humiliation observed only through the occasional glance from windows, and the subtle whispers of those who had long endured her petty tyranny. As night approached, the crowd gradually thinned, but the sense of collective satisfaction lingered, neighbors sharing final images and videos, recounting the story to friends and family, and discussing how a single well-planned act could dismantle an entire regime of arbitrary rules and petty intimidation, while Karen's presence, though physically stationary in her home, had become psychologically irrelevant, a symbol of authority that had been publicly, incontrovertibly challenged and defeated. I walked along the street one last time, inspecting the tank, ensuring it remained secure, and allowing residents to admire it one final time, exchanging smiles and nods, understanding that what they had witnessed was more than spectacle. It was a lesson in courage, preparation, and the power of acting decisively when confronted with unjust authority, and that the story of the day would reverberate long after the tank was gone, inspiring laughter, admiration, and perhaps even subtle rebellion in a neighborhood that had long been defined by conformity and fear. Karen, exhausted, flustered, and defeated, finally retreated from public view, closing blinds, locking doors, and resigning herself to the realization that she had lost control in a way that would be remembered by everyone present. Her authority permanently diminished, not by lawlessness or chaos, but by legality, audacity, and the strategic application of both, proving that rules and power, no matter how meticulously constructed, are only as strong as the respect they inspire, and, when that respect is absent, the consequences can be monumental, visible, and unforgettable. By nightfall, the tank remained, a silent guardian of victory, gleaming under streetlights, while the neighborhood collectively processed the day's events, understanding that compliance is voluntary, authority is conditional, and audacity backed by foresight, preparation, and legality can create a spectacle that reshapes social dynamics in ways that are both permanent and entertaining, leaving a legacy that would be recounted with humor, awe, and admiration for years to come. And as I finally locked my own driveway reflecting on the unfolding of events, I knew that the story was complete. Karen's petty tyranny had been publicly, undeniably dismantled, the community's confidence had been restored, and the tank, a symbol of clever defiance, would forever stand as a reminder that bold, thoughtful action can triumph over arbitrary authority, leaving an entire neighborhood empowered, amused, and forever changed.